a painting of the Westboro.
Nice. Okay, so I don't see very many more people coming in, so we might as well get underway. Fiona, you're back. Great. So hello, everyone. My name is Jeff Leeper. I'm the City Councillor for Kitchissippi Ward. I recognize, I think, all of the names of the participants who are here this evening. Thank you very much. There are, in addition to the 5 panelists who you see on the screen, 23 attendees so far this evening. If that number changes significantly, I will let people know as the evening goes on. And we're here to take a look at the staff proposal for rezoning the part of Westboro where the triplex freeze was implemented. I'm going to let Robert take us through how we got to this point and what it means and where we go from here. I think most of you have probably read the blog post that I put up indicating that, you know, I'm generally supportive. I'm giving staff pushback on some high-level items in the rezoning that they're proposing, but I am generally supportive of what they're doing. I don't want to repeat my whole blog post, and maybe I'll just ask Fiona if she can throw the link to that if you haven't read it into the chat box so that you can link and save that if you have not. And in my blog post, I did make mention, I think it's important for people who live elsewhere than just this study area to be cognizant of what they're doing. Because as we intensify, particularly in our mature neighborhoods, my guess is that many of the elements of the Westboro infill study that you're going to see this evening are going to be carried over into other neighborhoods. And I do see, as I look down the list, I see folks who are in Hintonburg and elsewhere. Many of you have probably followed some of the R4 zoning, which has introduced new density into those neighborhoods. This is an R3 zone. If you live in an R3 zone in one of our mature neighborhoods surrounding or ringing downtown, I suspect that you'll start to see proposals made for your neighborhood along these lines. And most immediately, of course, it would result in immediate zoning changes for Westboro in the particular area of the R3R that we're looking at. What I do hope is that this should stop the parade of variances going to the Committee of Adjustment. There is clearly a level of intensification that the city and council are willing to see implemented in Westboro. And the current zoning, which was done in the 60s, does not reflect the current planning thinking about intensification. And my hope is that this study will be a model for updating zoning to indicate what council is really truly considering the upper limit of what we want intensification to be. But I don't want to preview too much because Robert does have a presentation. I'm going to turn it over to Fiona just to describe how the evening will work, and we'll go from there.
Perfect, thanks Jeff. Thanks everyone for joining here tonight. So for those of you who haven't participated in a development open house webinar with us before, some stuff might be new to you on this platform. So we just want to go over a few housekeeping things before we get underway. For those of you who've done this a few times with us now, just you know what you're doing, so sit back, it's great. So very shortly, Robert's gonna go through a presentation. He's gonna share a screen and you're gonna see a presentation. After that, we're going to move into a Q&A. So if you are on a laptop or a desktop, you can scroll your mouse to the bottom of your screen and you should see the Q&A button. If you click that, you can insert questions. I will then moderate the Q&A discussion. So as we go through them, I will read the questions out loud. I'll click a button and then you'll be able to see everyone else's questions and then the panelists will answer it. Usually I like to demonstrate, but unfortunately I don't have my second laptop available at the moment. And once they get answered, you'll be able to see that they've been answered. You'll notice that there is a chat function and we can send you things. You should see, if you haven't clicked it already, a little red notification on the chat box because I have included the link to the Jeff's blog post. So hopefully you can access that. You can't communicate to us through the chat. You can only communicate to us through the Q&A. So I do see a hand raised. We're not going to be using hand raised tonight. The way you want to communicate with us tonight is through the Q&A function. So even if you have a comment about Zoom, or if something comes up, you can message me through the Q&A. It's not going to show up for everyone. I have to approve it. So that's how you can reach me during the panel with anything technical, and that's how you can submit your questions for the formal Q&A. We are recording this, and we'll edit it slightly, and then it will go on YouTube next week or so. So if any of your neighbors are interested and they're not able to attend, you can send them that later. And then, of course, I'm going to try my best to not read repeated questions, but I understand that some people may, filter in and out this evening just because we are virtual, and that's a positive of these formats. So if we reach the end of the session and you haven't had your question answered, you can definitely email us and we'll make sure that you get the information that you're looking for. That's absolutely not a problem. So I think I've covered everything. So with that, I will turn it on over to Robert for the presentation.
Thank you very much, and good evening, everyone. Before I launch into the presentation, I'd like to introduce everyone who's with me today. My name is Robert Sandercott. I am the planner dealing with the zoning amendment for the Westboro Infill study. With me is David Wise, who is the program manager for our zoning unit, and Alain Miguelez, who is manager of our planning policy unit, and he's dealing with the upcoming new official plan. So I'm just going to share my screen now so we can get the presentation underway. So I'll just double check everyone can see my screen fine.
Yep,
very good.
Thanks.
Wonderful. All right. So I'll just start with a quick summary of how we got here. As Councillor Lieber mentioned, this started in October 2018 when Council adopted an interim control bylaw. And what this did was put a freeze on the development of triplexes within the R3 zones in a portion of Westboro, bounded by Byron Avenue on the north, Dover Court on the south, Golden on the west, and Tweedsmuir Avenue on the east. These, as per the Planning Act, cannot remain in effect for more than 2 years. And the purpose of them is to essentially study specific land uses, in this case triplexes, and essentially to determine what exactly is appropriate within the area. Now, normally, since this was passed in October, that would mean the expiry would normally have actually been in October. But as we all know, the COVID-19 pandemic has happened and is still ongoing. There were provincial emergency orders that occurred, and as a result, this had the effect of extending the timeline. But now that those orders are no longer in effect, we are once again under a time limit, and that time limit, as you can see, is January 15th of next year. So it's necessary to report to Planning Committee and Council on recommendations prior to that repeal. In terms of past actions we've done on the study, we have released 2 discussion papers, first in September of last year and April earlier this year. And we also did an open house back in December of last year, which was quite well attended, essentially discussing past development trends, significant elements of character within streetscapes in the neighborhood in Westboro, and essentially the way forward based on the policy of the current official plan and the new official plan under development. So this is a quick summary of that past consultation that has been leading to this amendment. So with all those policies in mind, I want to lay out a few quick key principles that are behind the proposed zoning changes. So the first thing to keep in mind is that the city is growing. In fact, it's projected to grow by 400,000, I believe, within the next 25 years. So the fact of the matter is, infill and redevelopment in urban neighborhoods will occur as the city grows and as that demand for housing increases. The new official plan is still under development, but Council has adopted a number of policy directions, including the 5 big moves, preliminary policy directions, and a growth management strategy for how the city will accommodate that growth. And that includes an increase in the amount of growth through intensification as opposed to greenfield development. So with all of that in mind, one of the principles from those policies to keep in mind is the built form. So essentially how the building essentially actually lands on the street, its size, its height, its design, as well as how any sort of adverse impacts are handled are more important than the specific number of units that are within that built form, 1, 2, 3, or whatever. In addition, looking in any neighborhood, there are typically major streets and other corridors that, given what exists there, be it things like transit or other services, that may be more appropriate to concentrate a higher level of density. So with those principles in mind, the zoning amendment essentially divides this area into 4 areas. The first 2, A and B, essentially represent the major streets that are within the study area. Churchill Avenue being the most major street. It, of course, contains transit. It was recently redone to add additional infrastructure, including bike lanes. It represents essentially the primary north-south street in the study area. Other major streets that aren't quite of big prominence are Byron Avenue and Dovercourt Avenue, specifically only west of Churchill Avenue. In the case of Byron, it's considered a collector street under the current official plan. It is in closest proximity in the study area to things like Richmond Road, rapid transit stations in the future LRT, other services such as parks like the Byron Linear Park. In terms of Dovercourt Avenue, again, specifically west of Churchill, there is transit on that street. The Dovercourt Rec Center is in fact within the study area and right nearby. The other 2 areas, which are going to cover more of the lots, refer more to local streets. And this is where I will bring up the map just to kind of show what we mean. So this covers 2 areas. We see the corner lots on most local streets, as well as what I refer to as transition zones. So in the former case, corner lots are essentially kind of frame a local block. They're more prominent along the streetscape, and there's also fewer direct neighbors. In the case of those transition areas, they're areas that are more adjacent to major streets like Churchill and Byron. So, for example, the east side of Edison would count, the west side of Edison would not. So the east side being directly adjacent to Churchill. So these are areas that, because of their proximity to major streets, represent areas that are appropriate for density that's higher than the interior, but not to the same degree as the main street itself. And finally, area D, local streets, essentially refers to every other part of other streets. So it's going to be the most common designation. Density is expected to be kind of the lowest there, and generally in terms of built form, it's expected to be fairly consistent there. So to give you a bit of background on essentially how we got here, the current zoning for most of the study area is R3R, with I believe a little bit of R3S in one pocket. These zones permit single detached homes, semi-detached homes, and triplexes. It permits specifically for triplexes a 3-story height limit of 11 meters and a lower height limit of 8 meters for other dwelling types. So this is without any regard for any of that sort of context, regardless of whether it's a major street or a local street or anywhere else. So what that hypothetically means is, regardless of where you are, you can build a 3-story triplex according to the zoning, and it could hypothetically look like this. This is essentially showing what that zoning envelope is. You can see there that there's no regard for context. It's possible that there might be some specific changes to the built form building by building. You might see like a bit of a peaked roof, but generally speaking, regardless of the context, it allows a 3-story triplex. So again, presently, no regard for context, no difference between being mid-block or towards the corner of a block, no difference whether you're on a significant major thoroughfare like Churchill or a local street. So there's no regard for context there. So the major principles is essentially to, again, to concentrate the highest level of density towards edges of the neighborhood and major streets with lower density and height in the interior. Um, so this is essentially what that model is going to look like, and I will walk you through that. So very generally speaking, if we look at that same area again, this is what you'd get. Highest level of heights towards Churchill Avenue, going down as you go to other major streets such as Byron, as well as on the corner lots and areas like that. And finally, when you're in the interior of the neighborhood, it would be expected it would be smaller, less dense two-story forms. So again, this intends to actually take that sort of context into account. A three-story building mid-block is not going to fit as easily when compared with that sort of thing on a major street such as Byron or Churchill. There is context taken into account and better recognition of essentially where you are and what's around you. So what I'm going to do is essentially walk you through each of the sort of areas we look at, the key principles behind what we're proposing, and the actual zoning regulations that are proposed to come from that. So the biggest important one is the subject of density. And it is, as we said, an appropriate and desirable thing. It can bring many good things to a neighborhood. It can bring services in support of it, from things like retail to necessary services like parks, transit, and other supporting functions like that. But when you insert it in, it is important to take care of the quality of life in that design, that both for existing residents and for new residents. So when we look at the major streets, again, we'd be looking at zoning those major streets, such as Churchill and Byron, to allow for low-rise apartment buildings. In the case of Churchill Avenue, being the most major street, that would permit up to 4-story development in general, whereas on Byron Avenue, since they're not quite as major as Churchill, up to 3 stories. In addition, on Churchill Avenue, we're looking at adding what we call the neighborhood commercial suffix. The idea being it is appropriate with that density to allow a range of non-residential services, very small scale, so like small scale cafes, small scale retail, within close walking distance as essentially supporting functions to that new residential. In addition, we would be prohibiting any infill on Churchill from being either a new detached dwelling or a semi-detached dwelling, because again, the intent is to concentrate higher levels of density on those streets. So if you're developing, it should be a high density use if you're developing on a major street. So this is an example of what that sort of major street context would look like. This is an existing apartment building on Churchill Avenue located south of the study area. There's a portion of Churchill Avenue that is within an R4 zone where these are already permitted. So this is generally what you can expect, what you would expect to see. When we go onto local streets, there will still be infill and redevelopment, but it will be at a smaller scale and one that is compatible with the existing build form. That means 3-story development is permitted on corner lots and those lots directly adjacent to major streets, including up to as much as 8-unit smaller scale apartment buildings, given that, again, they're either ones that frame the block and are more prominent or are directly adjacent to the major street. But once you get onto the interior, onto local streets, it's generally expected that height will be more contextual, which I'll talk about a bit later, and uses will be limited to things like no more than 3 units, as well as semi-detached or townhouses, which are essentially intended to be of a form that's much more reflective of the sort of built form that's there today. So we look at the local street context here. Here's an example of an existing home. A lot of them are more 1 to 2 stories. New build forms will be more in kind of the 2, maybe 3 with a peaked roof story range, and there'll be more things like detached dwellings, semi-detached dwellings, and the like. So getting into that subject of height and roof lines. as we said, it is the context here is important, and height should be dependent on context, just as permitted uses should be. Once again, Churchill Avenue 4 stories, Byron and Dovercourt west of Churchill 3 stories, but when you get to local streets, generally should be no more than 2 to 3 stories. On the interior of a block, this means generally limiting to a 2-story form. The one exception to this being that typically on a lot of local streets, since you see a lot more like existing houses and house forms where pitched roofs are more prominent, replicating that style would allow you to have a higher height. So 10-meter height, which can accommodate 3 stories, would be permitted, provided you provide a pitched roof with at least a 1 to 2 slope. So this ensures that, much like in a lot what you picture in a lot of existing houses, that if you're going to go taller, you're providing that sort of pitch that would be typical of more of a house form. So this is what that would kind of look like. On the left, picture basically kind of 2 3-story triplex boxes. Old zoning permits them to go to 11 meters, even if it's mid-block, regardless of where it is. What we're essentially looking to do on those local streets is, if you want to do like that sort of flat roof box, you're permitted, but you have to do it at a lower height that's more typical of the 2-story form. Or you can do a pitched roof and you have a little bit more leeway. Facades and articulation. So the facade of a house or a building contributes to the quality of the community as a whole. Providing a little level of articulation essentially does contribute to the public realm and adds visual interest to the building, presenting a respectful, good neighbor face. So essentially what we're requiring is at least a certain portion of the facade be recessed by at least 0.6 meters. This is actually something that was first introduced in our R4 zoning review, and this is something we're looking to apply in Westboro to a more R3 context. So again, going back to our before and after, this is what it would look like. Right now, the zoning permits you a box. It permits you a 3-story box for a triplex, and it says you don't have to do anything more than a box. Now what we're essentially looking to do is to ensure that there's a little bit of articulation to break up that boxy mass. So there is still some architectural flexibility in terms of how you break it up. For example, you can break up part of the story all the way up, or maybe you can have like a little area forward with the rest of the dwelling back. The important thing is that there be some articulation. Rear yards and landscaping. So rear yards have a number of functions. They provide amenity space for people. They're the place where people can kind of go outside, hang out, and enjoy the outdoors. But they also provide a number of functional benefits. For example, rear yards within a block contribute to the overall block for things like stormwater. They provide space for the mature tree canopy. And trees, of course, was, I think, a major topic that was raised with us by residents throughout the study. So with that in mind, we want to see rear yards on any sort of infill, providing that sort of space for those sort of uses. In particular, space for landscaping to retain the mature tree canopy. That would come in the form of a buffer abutting the rear lot line. So that can range from a minimum 3 meters on, if it's a lot on a major street, or as much as 4.5 meters in other cases. And the purpose of this is to ensure that there's a specific aggregated landscaped area that must be provided first, landscaping first, before any of the other functions that you might have in a rear yard, hard surfacing, parking, other buildings like that may be provided. Another thing to keep in mind is that on particularly deep lots, they typically involve particularly deeper rear yards, as the building generally doesn't take up as much of the lot on a rear lot. So when infill occurs in these contexts, we would want to ensure that the form in that case is not significantly bigger and significantly deeper than the existing rear block context. So on deep lots, we're saying no part of a building may locate further than 24 meters from the front lot line. And the purpose of that is to essentially say you can't go behind a certain point to ensure that the new building that comes in doesn't essentially dwarf the other ones on a deep lot, large rear yard context. Parking, certainly a very hot button issue. In general, the zoning bylaw does not require on-site parking for anything containing 12 units or less. And in general, the emphasis is on walkability. So that is something that we are intending to keep. So in general, a lot of infill within the neighborhood certainly does provide parking and desire parking, but that's just what it is. It is desired. It is not required. And therefore, if a development desires to include parking, that is something that should be provided only after all of their site requirements are met. The mature tree canopy is a great example. That should only be something that is provided if you have space to either retain mature trees or ensure the effective planting and growth of new ones. So with that in mind, what we're proposing is, in the case of surface parking, requiring permeable or porous surfaces to aid in that soft landscaping. In addition, and these were actually originally introduced in our R4 review as well, any sites such as on major streets containing low-rise apartment buildings, which is 4 units or more, are not permitted to have parking if the lot is of a small size. And the idea is that at a certain point, there's not an ability to really accommodate parking in a functional way that ensures all those other site requirements, landscaping, and appropriate build form are met. And finally, we're proposing to, again from the R4 review, implement a requirement for physical barriers in the front yard, preventing illegal parking in the front yard, ensuring you retain space for like landscaping and other uses which are necessary in the front yard. So combining those two thoughts together, here's what a rear yard would look like. On the left side, looking at our triplex box, a lot of the triplexes that have been built typically are built with parking areas in the rear yard. And the way that they're developed, commonly this becomes the main focal point of the site. It turns the rear yard into a parking lot. There may be some landscaping wrapped around it. It's often not effective enough to allow for retention of trees or growth of trees. In some cases, some of that gets swallowed up for more hard surfacing. So what we're now saying, you have to provide your landscaping first. Provide landscaping along the rear lot line. If you have space left over for parking, then you want to provide it, you can. But if there's not space to provide the level of parking you want, then there's something you're going to have to trade off. In the example here, that may mean providing your parking within a building, within the building footprint, such as inside the building in a garage. Landscaping is what has to be emphasized. I'll quickly talk about other yards. This is and the last topic within the current proposal. So we do talk about front yards. These are a key element of streetscape character. They're the sort of face that's presented to the public. When we're emphasizing walkability, setbacks in an urban setting are generally intended to be shorter. We're allowing for more intense pedestrian use while still ensuring area for like landscaping and street trees in the front yard. So on major streets, we're looking for a front yard setback of 4.5 meters, which is a little shallower than on local streets, but allows for that pedestrian connection while still maintaining space for front yard and street trees and other uses. In the case of side yards, these are much more functional. They provide light and airflow between buildings, and most importantly, they provide for access for things like waste management, functional movements, necessary infrastructure such as HVAC and other utilities like that. It's also important to ensure consistency in build form because, again, we are looking to regulate primarily the form. So we're looking to establish a consistent side yard setback, and we've proposed 1.5 meters. This is an increase in the case of certain dwelling types. A lot of dwelling types do require 1.2 meters or 4 feet. We'd effectively be looking to raise that to 5 feet, which is consistent with the requirement for an apartment building where you do need a little bit more space. There's a little bit more activity in terms of needing to access the rear yard. So the 1.5 we felt was appropriate for that. So I pretty much described the entirety of the amendment. I do want to get into some related regulations to this because infill is something that is occurring and expected to occur in urban neighborhoods across the city. With that in mind, earlier this month, Council introduced a number of new infill regulations which apply to all neighborhoods inside of the Greenbelt, and that includes Westboro. Big one is we've updated our streetscape character analysis requirement. And what this requires is that new development must meet dominant streetscape characteristics along your street. In other words, the ability to have like a single wide or a double wide driveway, or the need to have your front entrance face the street, is essentially determined by what is everything else existing on the street doing. You have to meet those elements of the character. In addition, it required for landscaping first. We're proposing in Westboro to require that first in the rear yard. The infill regulations are more generally requiring that to be provided in the front yard in the form of a minimum aggregated area, essentially to ensure space and soil volume for street trees. It also restricted maximum driveway widths, essentially to ensure that you have that landscaping provided first. Another couple of things, we are in the midst of developing urban design guidelines for infill. So these will be more guidelines essentially dictating what sort of form and design elements we would expect to see in low-rise infill. These, I believe, we're looking to bring them out sometime in 2021. And finally, we've updated our urban tree bylaw, which is to come into effect in January. These include new rules for tree protection and tree planting, and these are going to be a lot more geared to infill situations. So there's a bit more teeth in terms of those sort of issues that come up with infill, tree retention, tree planting, and the like. So in summary, the proposed regulations are going to set a clear path for where the highest level of growth in Westboro will be directed, the sort of built form you can expect to see, and sort of contextual elements relating to that built form, and more generally, how policies under development, such as the new official plan, are going to address growth in urban neighborhoods. So thank you for the presentation. More details on the amendment are at our website, ottawa.ca/Westboro infill. You can provide comments to me by the end of next week, November 5th. Again, we are on a very specific timeline as we are looking to have this reviewed by council before the interim control expires. So recommendations will be presented to Planning Committee on December 10th so that they can be reviewed by council in January. Thank you very much.
Awesome. Thanks, Robert. So we will start the Q&A. I only have 2 questions right now. So if you've been thinking about anything, now is definitely the time to put that in the Q&A. We'll start with the first one. To declare my interest, I live on the west side of Athlone, south of Byron and north of Wesley. I have read both Robert's discussion paper and Jeff's blog. I have to confess that to the lay person, this is difficult material to get fully a hold of, but I must commend all of you for making all the documentation relatively understandable. Well done. My question relates to the transition areas and how it is that some parts are corner lots, but others are broader swaths covering complete blocks, such as mine, which do not appear to be consistently drawn east of Highcroft, south of Byron. Can you please explain how this is decided?
Would it help if I maybe scrolled back to the slide containing the map? Okay, we'll do that. So I admit I did kind of lump in, I think, 2 things into one quote unquote area here, because they do kind of have different rationales for it. The transition zones are, again, essentially the ones that are supposed to be directly next to major streets, such as Byron Avenue. Because the idea is they're close to a major street, maybe not as much density as a major street, but it's appropriate to have a little bit higher than when you're further in the interior and further away from those areas. Turning specifically to the corner in question, I would say that if you look at the lots on the north side of Byron, they are either close enough to or abutting the lots on Byron such that they qualify as a transition area. And then you cross the street, and again, you see corner lots. So you see one corner lot on Athlone, and then the next corner lot on Tweedsmuir, kind of butting next to each other. So it kind of looks like it essentially covers the whole street because that's just the way the corner lots are oriented. Now, in terms of the corner lots, the rationale for those is that they are more prominent by being located at intersections rather than mid-block. And the other part of that is that there's less direct neighbors. Rather than 3 or more direct neighbors, if you are mid-block, as well as across the street generally also being smaller, your neighbors on 2 sides are the street. So with that in mind, and with the prominence that that carries, there's a little bit more rationale for a larger build form than if you were to try and do that, say, on the middle of the east side of Highcroft, where you're in the middle of a whole bunch of smaller homes.
Okay, thanks, Robert. Next question. We are 2 blocks away from the study area. Can we expect any changes on approvals for variances?
I mean, anything that's outside of the study area would be outside the scope of this specific review. So, I mean, in terms of variances, they would have to be reviewed on the merits of the bylaw as it exists today. I mean, understandably, there's certainly a lot of limits to that, as I'm sure people can see and have appreciated. We're trying to kind of shift more to directly regulating the form of infill, where the present bylaw doesn't really focus a lot on that. So certainly I can appreciate the concern there, but the scope is very specific to the study area because it's based on an interim control bylaw, and the interim control bylaw defines the scope.
Okay, thank you. With the idea that these regulations will go across Ottawa, is the Committee of Adjustment taking these into account in proposals being put forward now in areas outside of Westboro?
So like, just to understand the question, is it essentially that like what sort of direction the committee would take now if it's like a development outside of this study area, or is it kind of like in the future as we move forward with the official plan and new zoning to support that?
I'm not sure, Jeff.
Yeah, I'm going to suggest that the question is, you know, if these proposals for this R3R move through, would it be open to people who are to say, listen,
Gotcha.
here's the direction council is moving in. When you're considering your 4-part test, you know, be cognizant that this is what's happening in this area, and that we may well see that these sort of rules are put in place in other parts of the mature neighborhoods.
I certainly appreciate that question. Certainly understand where they're coming from. I would suggest that the difficulty is not to speak directly for the Committee of Adjustment, that they have to kind of review the policies and zoning that are before them today. That's not to say that someone can't raise them, but I certainly wouldn't guarantee how much weight they would necessarily assign to them, just because they have to review based on the zoning and based on the official plan that's before them today. Those policies we're certainly moving forward with changing those policies, but that's the caveat I would give.
Well, I assume that we're going to see some of this brought in again if these move forward, and we'll get our clarity over the next several months once this gets implemented for this R3R. I note that David wanted to jump in as well.
No, I think that I think Robert actually covered it really quite well. I think, as Robert said, the Committee of Adjustment is a quasi-independent body. They evaluate things according to what the zoning bylaw actually says, and that's how they have to review these things. So they'll take the decisions as they go. I think one of the things that we do have to keep in mind is that with Council's passage of the infill amendments, which did go across all of the urban area, the landscaping first part of that, which does apply to Westboro and does apply to all of the other neighborhoods outside of Westboro, that is something that the Committee of Adjustment now can have regard to, because those are now, once they've cleared the appeal period, those would be in effect, and those would be then the new rules for the zoning bylaw. So with respect to that aspect of it, that's something that the Committee of Adjustment can absolutely pay attention to.
Can or must?
Must.
Must.
Thank you.
Okay. Will these changes stand up to requests from developers for exemptions? Or what is the interaction with developers' requests to do something not outlined in the planning?
So again, I think we're kind of talking now like variances to these new rules that come forward, right? Or amendments or things like that. And certainly I can appreciate that as that is a big concern. Certainly there's been a lot of development by variance within this part of Westboro. I mean, what I can say to that is the intent of this is to provide more specific direction through the zoning on the type of form that we will allow. And so when variances come in, right now we often see variances to the lot. So such as on, you know, the lot width, the lot area, but not necessarily related to either the building or what actually goes on that lot. Now we're kind of trying to shift to a model where it's now more directly regulating what goes on that lot. So if I want to build a higher building than on a local street than what's permitted, if I want to provide less landscaped area, similar to what we've seen with those parking areas than what's permitted, there's going to be clear direction and clear intent on why in the zoning on why those sort of things are necessary and how they address the context. So, I mean, I'm not going to say variances can't happen because a property owner always has the right to apply for a variance, but now they're going to need to explain, you know, these rules have come into effect to address the context of Westboro. How are you actually maintaining that context? And if they cannot sufficiently answer that, then certainly planning staff would not be favorable to it, and they should not expect a favorable outcome. And I would also note that a thing that we've done in our recent planning reports, such as with the infill amendments that we mentioned, is we're now looking to provide more specific direction to Committee of Adjustment as well as the planning staff who comment on those applications, essentially really outlining very clearly why these rules are coming forward, and very generally speaking, like what sort and what context of variance requests would be particularly inappropriate. So that would be in the report that would go to Planning Committee, in this case in December.
David and Robert, in the run-up to the most recent changes to the infill, that was again a very long process that kicked off even a couple of years ago. I remember you spoke to the track record of variances and how those changed when the new infill rules were put in. In that, you know, the clarification of council's intent for infill changed some of the variances that people were applying for and getting. So for example, developers have had very little success getting additional height in the wake of infill 2, I guess.
Yeah.
I don't know if you have any of those stats or color at hand, but I personally find it reassuring that when council says this is what we mean, the Committee of Adjustment tends to respect that. But could you add some color to that?
I'll just start. I don't recall all the stats specifically straight offhand. I think I think the best thing, if anyone is very curious about it, is they can go back to the May 22nd, 2018 Planning Committee using the Ottawa.ca search tool to go back through the agenda, and they can pull up the infill monitoring report that we submitted to Planning Committee on that May 22nd date. That provided an analysis of the Committee of Adjustment and the variances, and also what was successful and what wasn't successful. I can't remember off the top of my head, Councillor, exactly what it was there, but I do recall, yes, indeed, that a lot of the variances did shift pretty dramatically in terms of what the committee was doing. Height was definitely one of them. Also, we've also seen a reduction in the granting for rear yard setbacks as well too. Infill 2 increased the rear yards quite a bit, from 7.5 to, in some cases, up to 9 meters, depending on those lot widths. And any reductions in rear yard setbacks that the variances did grant for rear yards did not go back to 7.5 or less than that. It would have gone from, say, 8.9 to 8.5 or 8.4, but still an increase from what was there before. So yeah, having those directions absolutely does take into effect. The Committee of Adjustment does pay attention to those, particularly when there is clear council direction and also staff direction as well too, that's included in the reports that are accompanying those documents.
I don't know if there's a question in the queue, but staff reports will be something that I'll throw into the Q&A if it doesn't get in there, but I'll let Fiona move on to the next one.
Thank you. Okay, given that many streets have had lots of changes already and the new context now has no trees and lots of hardscaping, what will happen with those neighborhoods?
I mean, in terms of things like the trees specifically, as far as zoning goes, I would again kind of direct to that principal intent of landscaping first. And I mean, certainly we do have a streetscape character analysis, which bases certain aspects on what's existing along the streetscape. But the landscaping, I think, was one that I think we kind of recognized through the infill process is something that is, I think, a common interest in a lot of residential neighborhoods within the city. So even if the rest of the street is hardscape today, for example, in the front yard, we're going to require that minimum aggregated landscaped area so that you have space that can support a tree on your infill site. And in Westboro, what we're proposing in the rear yard, again, is kind of off that similar landscape first principle. We want to ensure that you have a certain amount of area in the rear yard that can contribute to that tree canopy that's there or can regenerate. I can expand into further detail in other areas, but by the sound of the question and the focus of it sounded on trees.
I just want to be absolutely clear here, just for everyone. I appreciate that in some cases there's been development that happened prior to the passage of Infill 2 back in 2015. That might have happened during the transition period for Infill 2 between 2015 and 2017, where those houses, and I remember this came up in the open house last year as well too, where driveways were widened and a lot of the front yard was taken up by asphalt, parking lots, walkways, things like that. Unfortunately, those types of situations would now be considered legal non-conforming. So which means that they were legal when they were built, and as long as they continue to be there, they remain legal, even though the zoning bylaw has changed. That is to say, though, that if somebody were to change that property or alter that or discontinue that use, they would lose those legal non-conforming rights. So unfortunately, these existing situations, sometimes unfortunately we have to look at that and say, okay, those are unfortunate lessons that we need to learn from, but more importantly is we need to set directions to ensure that that doesn't happen again in the future. And that's also part of what these new rules are all about, but also in terms of how we move forward with making sure that these things don't happen through after development, through post-approval, people doing landscaping work or something like that. That's an ongoing thing that we're going to have to keep our eye on.
Thank you. How will mature trees be protected with the new tree bylaw? For example, in a case where a proposed infill development will eliminate several distinctive trees.
Robert, do you want me to answer that or poke at that?
Yeah, I don't have the exact regulations top of mind.
Yeah, that's fine. The urban tree bylaws is a very substantial change actually from the existing context, and a lot of that is with respect to the designation and how we are going to treat distinctive trees. That is to be large trees, and one of the things that's really important here is that the size radius, the um, the diameter of the tree trunk. Uh, the threshold for that will be smaller, which means that in the old times it used to be used to have a tree that was half a meter in size, in diameter, before it could be considered a distinctive tree and labeled for protection. That number is going to be smaller. I think it's 30 centimeters now. And so that's a big improvement. And what that does is that captures trees that are younger and they're earlier in their life cycle. So they still have decades of life left to contribute to that, rather than picking up only old trees that might in fact actually be near the end of their life cycle. So that's going to be, we think that's going to be a pretty big change. Along with that as well too, is that a developer now also needs to provide tree information reports along with their applications. So they need to show where those trees are on the property and also provide some additional controls on how they're intending to safeguard them through development. Internally as well too, the city is making some process changes in terms of including working more directly with forestry. So forestry will be actually involved in and helping to assist in the review of infill developments, and also providing some commentaries with committee of adjustment reports as well, committee adjustment notes as well too. So we think that there's an awful lot of change that's been happening within the regulations and also within the city processes that we think are going to provide more ability to retain, replace, and renew the urban tree forest canopy. In some cases, we may not be able to save an existing tree, but we'll look for that tree to be replaced in kind somewhere else on that lot, if at all possible. So that'll be a pretty significant change. And as Robert noted, we're looking at that coming in at the end of this year in January.
Thank you. Can you expand on built form is more important than the number of units?
So presently, if you look at the zoning bylaw, and I'm not just talking like the R3R zone or the R3S zone in the study area, but the way that a lot of zones generally work in residential, the primary sort of determining factor on what's permitted and what your standards are is the number of units in the building. In a lot of zones, you have one set of standards for detached homes. It requires so much lot width, so much lot area, and a specific building envelope. If you decide to put 2 or 3 units in a building, suddenly you require a bigger lot and you have a different permitted building footprint. So it's standards that are ultimately based on use and not necessarily the actual form or design that use takes. What we're trying to shift to is consistent standards based on what's actually taking place. So, for example, right now there are a number of uses that require a 12-meter wide lot. If you look at the development pattern in Westboro, as well as the existing lot pattern in Westboro, lots most commonly take one of 3 lot widths. 10-meter lot widths are the most common, 15 meters and 20-meter lots, and some of the 20-meter lots get developed into 2 10-meter lots, are also common. So, I mean, first of all, tying the minimum size of a lot to the actual context, so that 10-meter wide lot width that is actually the most common, and then basically giving you one consistent built form envelope. So in the case of local streets, that includes defining a specific height, defining a specific amount of articulation, defining a specific areas for like rear yard landscaping and front yard landscaping that have to be adhered to. And provided that you do it in such a way that's in context, provided that you do it in such a way that keeps all the impacts of that form on site to the absolute extent possible, provided that can be accomplished, then it's not as crucial, whether it's 1 unit or 2 unit or 3 units. What's important is what that form is and keeping whatever impacts arise from that on the site.
Thank you. Once this plan is approved, will it put an end to city hearing and approvals of minor variances for individual lots by developers? Or will this just mean greater density as a baseline with continued approval for further variances?
So what I would say to that is, I mean, the caveat is always that a property owner has the ability to apply for a minor variance. That's ultimately under the Planning Act. But what we are aiming to do is essentially provide more direct guidance as to what sort of variance can actually be contemplated, and very directly what sort of deviations from build form in the neighborhood are unacceptable, so that there's a bit more certainty as to what is developed, so that you avoid the sort of pattern of development by variance that we see in a lot of areas, and essentially more directly manage the expectations that can come from that sort of development. So there's going to be a lot more direct guidance on what the Committee of Adjustment should be considering when variances do come in, the sort of standards that we can expect, and the sort of level of justification that someone requires if they do try to apply to vary that. So that's the general principle there. We're generally expecting variances to have a very high level justification. Maybe it's a case where there's extenuating circumstances based on it being a non-standard lot, for example, but not something that should be the norm in any sort of proposed development.
If I can just add to that a bit, a key thing that we are trying to do here is we are taking a zoning package for Westboro that is 50 plus years old, 1960s zoning, designed for a very different city, designed for a very, very different kind of a neighborhood. And the zoning in the past has been reactive. It has not conformed with what the actual demand is. It is not conformed with where the private residential market wants the neighborhood to go. And when you have a reactive zoning, you have exactly what Westboro has been getting. Spot zoning, variances, really it's uncontrolled. And so what the proposal that is before you today is our best shot at looking forward and developing zoning that is proactive and that will guide the development in the direction where we want it to go. We can't stop development in this neighborhood. We can't tell people that they can't sell their houses. We can't tell people that they cannot move to this neighborhood. This is a private market. What we can do is we can encourage them where housing is being provided to put the higher density housing more towards the edges and provide more stability in the interior, while still accommodating the demand that will always be there. So this is what we're trying to do. There will still be, as Robert said, the opportunity for a developer to request a variance, but by putting in a proactive zoning environment where we are getting ahead of the curve and providing that future-looking direction, we can focus those variances towards things that are truly site-specific in nature. And that's what we're trying to do here.
Can I just ask on that note, clearly when the Committee of Adjustment is looking at requests for variances and it's applying its four-part test, and one of the key parts of that test is, does it meet with the official plan? And like so much in Kitchissippi, we have zoning that is legacy of a different era, different official plans. If we had to look forward, You know, even in the past 4 years, council has declared a climate emergency. It has declared a housing crisis. The new official plan will take us in a direction that is doubling down, if I may, on intensification, on building denser 15-minute neighborhoods. To what extent will this zoning be in compliance with the official plan that we pass 15 years from now? How many years will this zoning reflect official plan thinking? And I know that is an impossible question to ask, but how future-proof is this? You know, I can't foresee that we're going to change. I can't foresee that we're going to change the official plan drastically in the next 10 years once we pass the next one. But for how many years should we be future-proof?
So, Councillor, I'd like to maybe offer a couple of thoughts on that, if I may. As you know, my team is working on the official plan, and the official plan is for 25 years. So we are looking at the horizon of 25 years, but as you remember, also through the Ottawa Next Beyond 2036 exercise, we also wanted to take a longer look at the city in order to start thinking about what we need to anticipate past the life of this official plan, and think of how the city can continue to grow livably as a city of neighborhoods, as a resilient city, as a sustainable city, towards a population of 2 to 3 million. In other words, for those who will be doing our jobs in 20 years, 30 years, 40 years, what tools are we leaving in their hand? And it's fair to say that as much as we keep saying, you know, a city is never finished, a neighborhood is never finished, things evolve, generations come and go, and each neighborhood goes through various layers and iterations of evolution. These things are incremental, and I think the key thing that we want to monitor here is the speed at which change will actually take place. And it will be a different answer for each neighborhood. As we know, some neighborhoods are in high demand at certain periods of time, and then things calm down, and the high demand sort of moves over to another neighborhood. And in much bigger cities, that process is much faster. In cities of our size, that process takes longer. And the popularity of Westboro has been going on for about a decade and a half, 2 decades. But it may well be that, you know, toward the end of the 20s and into the 2030s, there's other neighborhoods that, for whatever reason, become the it neighborhood. They become the popular neighborhood, and the acceleration that we've seen in Westboro in the past decade and a half moves over, and things sort of even out in Westboro. That's entirely possible as well. So part of putting forward an official plan is monitoring how things go. As you know, we have the annual development report, and as soon as the new official plan comes in, there may be new measures that we keep track of just to see how things are going, just as we do with population. It may be an incomplete answer, but off the top of my head, that would be a reasonable way to answer that.
It's an impossible question to answer, you know, but I cannot foresee that in our next official plan after this one, council is suddenly going to say, wait, we actually need to double the rate of intensification compared to what we were thinking 5 years ago.
No, probably not. These things, as I said, are incremental. And what we have also said in the staff report that accompanied the growth management strategy is that we would like to leave things in place for future councils to have the option to never expand the urban boundary again. If that is a decision of a future city council to continue with expansions to the urban boundary, it's up to them. But we also want to make sure that they have the option to not do that. And the way to make sure that we are future-proofing ourselves for such a choice in the future is to take stock of what we need to do in order to accommodate future population growth in existing neighborhoods. All existing neighborhoods, not just Westboro, but all existing neighborhoods. And that's sort of how we're framing this official plan.
no residents have concerns about what the neighborhood will look like 1 and 2 years from now while we're off on a flight of futuristic fancy. So I'll turn it back over to Fiona. Thanks for that, though. It's important to think about.
Okay, thanks. The ICB was promoted by residents. Sorry, the ICB was prompted by resident concerns about over-intensification, specifically multiple triplexes that would likely be subject to reasoning applications for the fourth units in the basements. These proposals not only authorize triplexes in the inner areas of Westboro, they actually go much further in enabling intensification. How can this be seen as anything other than a complete betrayal of the concerns and interests of Westboro residents? This will make things worse, not better.
So I would respectfully suggest here that, I mean, certainly the form of development that was coming in, particularly in forms of the triplexes, is very concerning for sure. It was a large built form, not really taking that sort of context into account, taking up all areas of the site for their building footprint, for their supporting parking, and for other functional things over some of those more recognized characteristics such as the tree canopy and other things. However, we do have to reconcile addressing that with the fact that the city is certainly growing. And we can certainly direct that growth in such a way that there's more certainty as to where the growth is going, but also certainty in terms of the form, so that when you get something, for example, in the middle of a local street, maybe it's a triplex, but maybe it's not in the form that takes up the entirety of the lot and maybe doesn't have that sort of ability that we've seen to add that illegal fourth unit after the fact. So, I mean, certainly appreciate that the form of development that we've been getting is something that can be improved upon. But I think the important thing here is that we are providing certainty as to where the growth will go, because ultimately there is going to be growth and there is going to be demand for that in Westboro and in other neighborhoods.
Okay, thank you. Question about parking. I understand the desire for more walking/transit, but streets that are not walkable, no sidewalk, and are not close to LRT, where are the cars going to park? If the development does not provide on-lot parking, it means street-only parking and potentially causing wintertime issues.
I mean, so there's a lot of elements to this, for sure. I mean, typically speaking, I mean, I can kind of speak from my experience as someone who rents and doesn't own a car. When I sort of look for something like that, I mean, not owning a car, I mean, that's not going to be a top of mind. Certainly, there are going to be people who own cars, looking for housing that is going to be able to support that. The general sort of thing that I would say is that where a development does not contain parking on site, I think it would kind of be recognized and communicated that you rent that at your own peril if there's no ability to park it legally. So you don't have a space on site, and the street doesn't permit on-street parking. It doesn't permit permit parking. So in general, I would say that if someone has a car and they aren't guaranteed a space, typically the response to that is they're not going to rent a space without parking. So I would say in that sort of instance, it kind of works both ways. If I own a car and I need parking because it's not a currently walkable location, I'm not going to be looking for a spot without parking. David, I don't know if you want to add to that.
Yeah, I'm going to chime in. I don't rent and I do own a car, so provide some balance there. I think one of the main things that we have to get from this is we are not prohibiting parking. We're not prohibiting on-site parking at all. What we are saying is that there's balance that needs to be done. What we heard loud and clear through the discussion papers, through the open house, through the as we heard it's, was that people felt that when parking was occurring in the rear yard, it was taking over all of the rear yard, and people were putting in, basically turning rear yards into parking lots, and that was causing a lot of neighborhood angst and impact. So what we were looking at is we were looking at setting some balances. If you want to put your parking in your rear yard, you still need to provide some soft landscaping, and more importantly, you need to provide a bit of room between the parking and that rear property line so that you can plant trees. You can plant hedges. You can do things to screen the parking so that you're not necessarily getting right into your neighbor's face with it. And that's all about just providing, again, some of that respect back and forth, and also some of that reasonable degree of managing neighborhood impacts between each other. If you do want to provide parking within the building envelope itself, certainly there's lots of designs that show that that works as well too. So there's all kinds of ways to provide that on-site parking for people who do want to have that car and they do want to be able to provide it. They can do it. It's just a matter of how do you make sure that that car isn't then causing problems for your neighbors, and managing yourselves appropriately.
Okay, thank you. Will developers still be able to build triplexes on the inner lots of local streets and then apply for rezoning for the fourth units?
So this is certainly, I think, an issue that we are looking at certainly curbing. It's a common thing that has certainly happened, not just in Westboro, but in other neighborhoods. To the extent possible, what I can say is that the zoning standards are aiming at reducing on those local streets the built form in which a triplex can locate. Right now, you essentially see 3 stories plus a basement. We're essentially reducing that to a 2-3 story form that is smaller. I would also note that, where these sort of things happen, certainly I think our intent going forward, at least in the case where committee of adjustment is involved, is to certainly be tougher where there's essentially a sequence of applications that's not what was really expected, like not being upfront with the actual full development there.
I just want to chime in on this one as well too, but this goes back to the earlier comments that we made about getting ahead of the market rather than being reactive to the market. And why are triplexes being built and then having that fourth unit adding on to it? It's happening because there's a demand. There's a demand for apartments, and the developers know this, and the people who want to move into there, they're looking for those units. So there's someone who's looking to achieve that market demand. So what this zoning is doing is the zoning is saying, hey, if you want to build a triplex on a local street within the neighborhood, then build a triplex. Build an actual honest to God triplex. And it is going to have a 2-story plus sloped roof for a pitch. It is going to be have landscaping appropriately in the front and the rear. It's going to have its on-site parking and its waste management managed. So it's going to fit in, and it's going to be a triplex. But if your intention is to build an apartment building, if your intention is to build something that is more catering towards those sort of smaller units that you might be looking for, then we've also provided the valve for that as well too. So there's an opportunity for someone who wants to be able to build those kind of multi-unit apartment buildings, which are also very, very good things for the neighborhood as well too. You can now go and you can find a spot where you can do that. And it's more on those major roads, more towards the edges of the neighborhood, where those densities can really complement the walkability, they can complement the servicing, they can take advantage of the transit, the sidewalks, the major infrastructure that the city's already provided in those locations. So again, it's all about balancing. It's not saying that the neighborhood is going to stay exactly the same, but we are saying that when you have larger change and when you have a greater rate of change, the city is going to encourage that to the fullest extent that we can, to have that occur more towards the major roads and less towards the local roads.
Thank you. And on a similar note, will developers still be able to sever lots and build semis with secondary units, effectively replacing single-family homes with a total of 8 dwelling units?
I mean, with respect to secondary dwelling units are something that is permitted at the provincial level. There's actually requirements that the zoning be able to permit secondary dwelling units in low density forms. So that's a Planning Act thing. And the zoning does permit things like semi-detached dwellings, which is one of the things in which a secondary dwelling unit can be located. So, I mean, there's not really any ability to make a distinction between a secondary unit in a new building versus a secondary unit in an existing building. The direction to allow those is something that comes from the province.
Okay, thank you. So some clarifying comments from an earlier question. They say, sorry, once again, we are on the 3rd lot south of Byron on the west of Athlone. We are not a corner lot. The equivalent lots on Highcraft/Edison are not included in the transition when we are. How come?
I wonder if that might be an error in the mapping. I do notice a couple of errors towards the Byron side. Like the intent is the directly adjacent lot there.
Can I just suggest to the questioner, can you email me that and we'll get you a response specific to your property, please?
Perfect. Thanks, Jeff. The next question, Hélène, I was hoping you could read this question since it is en français, s'il vous plaît.
La section Edison West entre Avondale et Princeton va-t-elle devenir une zone tampon comme celle au nord? So the question is the stretch of Edison to the west between Avondale and Princeton, will that become a buffer area just like the one to the north?
Avondale and Princeton. So I think the reason why that one to the north is in orange is it was actually a site that was recently rezoned for like a specific development proposal. So like it's the block to the north of the block in question that contains the Cornerstone House, and contained a whole bunch of new development that I think part of it got rezoned, I want to say 2008 or 2009, and the southern part of it got rezoned more recently when Cornerstone moved in. So I think that one was there to essentially recognize that the development that occurred there, which is more of a 3-story form, is different than the block context on other local streets. So it's not intended that any other local street would become that sort of transition or buffer zone. That's kind of recognizing the existing context specific to that block based on specific rezonings on that block.
Alors, M. Demers, en gros, la réponse est non. L'îlot qui figure maintenant comme zone tampon a été identifié à cause d'un développement particulier qui a lieu sur cet îlot. Mais l'intention n'est pas de prolonger la zone tampon vers le nord, comme vous y faites référence.
Okay, thank you. Okay. Not clear to me why the streets one over from Churchill is zoned brown. As someone who lives on one of these streets, it feels like an interior neighborhood, not a transition one. Can you go over this again?
So yeah, in terms of transition, it's essentially recognizing its proximity to what's essentially going to be on those major streets. Churchill, again, like the idea is it's the main north-south street, existing transit, existing bike infrastructure, all of those sort of things, which makes it appropriate for that highest level of density. Because you have all of those services right there that support that sort of increase. It's also appropriate to, in staff's opinion, on the lots essentially immediately next to it, which are also in close proximity to those services, to have a little bit more density than once you get into, say, Roosevelt or Melbourne, a couple blocks a bit west, which are further away from those. So the idea there is that it is still in proximity to those major streets and going to be in proximity to that sort of four-story form. So the idea with transition is it's transitioning down from four-story apartment building to 3-story form to that sort of 2 to 3-story form, smaller, that you can expect to see in the rest of the neighborhood.
Thank you. How soon will this apply across the city?
I'll take a stab at that. The new official plan is currently in progress right now, and it will be going to council for their review next year. Following the passage of the new official plan, if council approves, and it's also approved by the ministry, the zoning bylaw will then subsequently be updated to be consistent with the directions of the new official plan. And that process is going to be kicking off next year. It will take a few years to do that, but a key thing that we are going to be looking at is we are going to be looking at the regulations that we are proposing here in Westboro, and we're going to be looking at the uptake of how those regulations are brought in by industry. What is successful in curbing some of the excesses, what is providing the appropriate levels of balance, and are there other things that we need to do in order to move our way forward. We intend to take these examples and use them in other neighborhoods all the way across where we have mature neighborhoods and apply. So we would see these regulations potentially moving forward into Vanier, into Alta Vista, into other neighborhoods at Queensway Terrace, et cetera, where we think that they will also provide and help out with a lot of that balance is there. So I would expect that in one way, shape, or another, that in the next few years, certainly within 5 years, that all of the neighborhoods across the city and all the zoning across the city would be updated, and a lot of the regulations that we're proposing here will be expanded all the way across the remainder of the city as well.
One of the things, and we don't have time to talk to it this evening, I'm sorry, but I'll be interested in chatting with you about what this means for our 2 neighborhoods and our 1 neighborhoods as we undertake. You know, how does this hierarchy of streets concept, et cetera, translate into lower density neighborhoods? We've dealt with R4. We have interesting concepts that can be applied through the R3. I'll be very interested to see how this translates into R2 and R1 discussions as those get undertaken.
As will I.
Thank you. My major concern is with parking and the walkability concept. The reality is folks do buy cars and have a desire to transit outside the area in question and go out of town. The folks may live in a unit where no parking is required in residents of 12 units or less.
So I think this goes back to, I think, what we were saying before about this isn't necessarily prohibiting the ability to provide parking on a site. It's, even though it's not necessarily a requirement. I think certainly in response to the sort of demand that occurs within the neighborhood, certainly we've seen with the infill that comes in a lot of demand for parking with it. But the point of it is that if you're going to provide parking, then it has to be provided after those other sort of important characteristics. I keep kind of going back to landscaping because those surface parking lots, they do have an impact on things like the mature tree canopy. But those other elements have to be addressed before you can put any parking in. And if that means that you have to trade something off to do so, then I mean that's the way you'd have to get the development approved. If it means you have to trade off some of your building footprint and floor area to provide garages so that it's interior, then that would be the way to move the development forward. Certainly, we would encourage, since we are trying to kind of shift towards more walkable, and as the new official plan policies would want to put it 15-minute neighborhoods. Certainly, we'd want to see that transition towards walkability. But in terms of the ability to provide parking, it's still there. You just have to make sure it's done in a way that actually doesn't impact those important characteristics.
Thank you. And Alain commented, just so that no one misses it, as of 2011, sorry, as of the 2011 Origin Destination Survey, about 26% of households in this part of town don't own a car. Okay, can you summarize how the various mitigating rules, for example, landscaping first, 4.5 buffer, front yard requirements, facades, will work together to help preserve the character? I'm very tired, I apologize. Will work together to help preserve the character of the Westboro residential area. For example, there will be more intensification, but you will end up in a neighborhood that ...
So essentially, I think the characteristics that we're kind of looking at, and a lot of them I think were ones we discussed throughout the consultation and the study process. There's generally a desire to see some sort of consistency and certainty in built form and the form and size that infill take. There's a desire to ensure that intensification doesn't kill off the mature tree canopy. There's a desire to ensure that where parking is provided, you don't significantly increase the built form to do it. You don't have it spill over onto where the mature tree canopy is supposed to go. The way in which these are supposed to interact together is to ensure that, particularly on local streets, that the sort of built form is consistent with, even if it's not exactly the same as, the sort of housing and the sort of built form that you see today. So I think that's like, it sounds like a very general sort of sum up question, but the idea is that yes, intensification will happen, but it will happen in a way that the neighborhood you see today and the characteristics that you see today, 25 years, you're still going to see them, even if not every single building is exactly the same.
Thank you. Okay, continuing to the above, and this was typed at 7:48, so try to remember what this was in regards to. Continuing to above, the ultimate reality is that our streets have become parking lots that a neighborhood has not seen before. As a result, the neighborhood is seeing a huge impact on the character of the hood. Would you comment?
I think parking is an issue that every single neighborhood wrestles with, and certainly if it's not number one behind trees, then it's a close second. And parking is certainly a very big challenge that all neighborhoods have to deal with. On-street parking is a public resource. It is for everyone to use, but it is also a limited resource as well too. And one of the things that we noticed with infill, especially when you have semi-detached with multiple curb cuts, with driveway widenings, with walkways, with people sort of hardscaping over their front lawns and turning them all into parking pads, is what that does is that essentially privatizes a public good. It takes away space from the on-street and turns it all into private parking and removes all of that on-street parking. So that's certainly been a big problem, and that's why a big reason for why we provided some of that balance with the new infill rules on driveways and soft landscaping to minimize the impact of curb cuts and make sure that there's still on-street parking that's available to satisfy that. But the fact is as well too, is that there is also some transition that will happen as well too. The city has a brand new LRT system that's up and running. Stage 2 is in progress. There is an awful lot of works afoot to improve walkability, to improve cycling, to improve pedestrian movements, to improve transit within the city. And all of those things will change the reliance of people to have a car. It's not going to be overnight, absolutely, but it will change things as they go along. The other thing as well too is that the city does do an awful lot of studies with respect to trip generation traffic services and things like that, and traffic calming measures. That includes how we design roads as we go forward. A lot of comments has been that Westboro does still have some more rural cross sections as they go along. As the infrastructure renewal program moves its way through, and some of those streets see themselves being ripped up and rebuilt. They're going to be ripped up and rebuilt in different ways. So they're going to have more of an emphasis on sidewalks and boulevards and things like that. So it is a I understand and appreciate the pain. It's certainly something, again, that's not just Westboro. We hear it all the way across the entire city. But it's one of those things where the city does know about it, and there is plans to work on it, to change it. There are, of course, alternatives to that. One of the things that's available is permit parking. And the neighborhoods can petition and apply for those kinds of measures there, where to provide some controls with that. And those are just one of many different tools the city can use to help manage some of those traffic impacts that happen when in any neighborhood.
Thank you. So I just wanted to check in. It's 8:30 right now. We have about 10 or more questions remaining. I am going to take us to, I think, 8:45. So we'll start to slow down around then and try to get everyone, I would say, home for the night, but we're all already home. So off, enjoy the rest of their night. Okay. Has there been any discussion of limiting redevelopment if it could affect future installation of solar panels on roofs of existing neighboring residences?
Robert, I don't mind taking that.
Yeah.
And I think the main thing here is that we are looking at establishing some certainty of heights. For example, here, if you have a home that is right now has an 8-meter height, and you put some solar panels on that roof, and then a triplex comes along beside you, and it goes up to a full 3 stories, plus a very shallow slope roof. That can certainly create some shading impacts on you. So by providing some of that roof pitch on that 3rd story, that helps to reduce some of that shadowing impact. But the reality is as well too, is that if you're going to put a solar panel installation and you're putting that solar installation at a height that is lower than the permitted height within that neighborhood, you are taking a chance, and you're taking a chance on what your neighbor is going to do. And your neighbor has development rights as well too. But by providing some of that certainty with respect to what the heights are going to be within that neighborhood, so that you have some better knowledge of what could reasonably happen on the next door neighbor, the one directly to the south from you, that could give you a little bit more security as you go forward. That is, by the way, solar panels, green roofs, things like that. I'm sure that Councillor Leeper is keenly aware of that particular topic. Certainly the energy evolution package that was just passed recently did touch on that, and that's something that the zoning bylaw is going to be looking forward to in the future, and focusing a little bit more on what changes might need to happen in order to accommodate more of that type of infrastructure throughout our neighborhoods as we go forward.
Thank you. Is there a supporting infrastructure, bracket, sidewalks, curbs, storm, sewers, hydro, and light standard upgrades, etc., close bracket, plan that will be adopted along with this proposal for change in density?
I'll take that as well too, Robert. And the answer to that is flat out no. The reason for that is that the city has within infill areas development occurs on a lot-by-lot basis, one lot at a time. If we're doing a major plan of subdivision or a much more significant comprehensive a block redevelopment, for example, that would be accompanied by site plan or a plan of subdivision, where certainly all of those things would need to be included within that application. But when it's on a lot-by-lot basis, it is a gradual thing. However, we do have an entire city department, our infrastructure asset renewal department, who does look very closely at infill development as it goes along, and they're always testing what is the impact on our infrastructure capacity, our storm sewers, our water, our sanitary, all of those things. And that also flows back into our capital lifecycle renewal process. What I mentioned before is that we do have a program that goes through and redoes roads. So certainly when in areas where we see that there's more development that's happening, those areas can get bumped up a little bit higher on the queue as they go forward, because we know that the demand is there, particularly if we see that there's some capacity issues that might need to be addressed in the future as things go forward. So again, the answer is no, there's not going to be a major capital reconstruction program of all the sidewalks that happen commensurate with this. However, there are infrastructure plans, and certainly the infrastructure master plan that's under development right now does take into consideration infill, and it does take into consideration this lot-by-lot type of development, and how do we make sure going forward that the infrastructure is there to support it as it goes forward.
I just want to come in and say regardless of whether this is moved forward or not, this plan looks to put some parameters around what that future infill is going to look like. But we also have to recognize that, if we don't move forward with this plan, the area is still going to intensify at the kind of rate that we've been seeing. Nothing is going to stop those conversions of the single family homes into long semis that have, quite a number of units. That is having a stormwater management impact that I am talking relatively constantly with our planning department about, and they're aware that this is something that has to be addressed, not just in Westboro, but in all of our mature neighborhoods that are rapidly changing. One of the things I take note of, it's not a minor thing, but it's obviously not the main thrust of the report, is the requirement for things like permeable pavers. Again, some thinking about stormwater, but there are other processes at the city that lead to stormwater management changes. And then the policy of the city for the past several years has also been, when we rebuild streets in neighborhoods like this, we rebuild them with sidewalks. There used to be, certainly I've been involved with neighborhood politics for more than 20 years now. That used to be a fairly political decision. If residents didn't want a sidewalk in front of their streets, the councillor had lots of sway to say yes or no. Today, as we have that thrust toward 15-minute neighborhoods, we have council-approved policies that say we're putting sidewalks in neighborhoods like these when we rebuild the streets. I think Alain wanted to jump in as well.
No, thanks, Councillor. And just wanted to build on David's answer. David is correct in that the zoning package itself does not address infrastructure, but for people who are interested in getting involved in discussing any upgrades such as sidewalks and curbs and storm sewers, there is the infrastructure master plan that is underway at the same time as the official plan. Because our growth management strategy calls for the majority of new population in Ottawa to come through intensification, the first focus of the infrastructure master plan is existing neighborhoods. And in addition, there is a transportation master plan. And one of the layers of that one is the active transportation master plan. Active transportation is, using your own 2 feet either to walk or to bike. So there is an active transportation master plan, and it deals with where we should be prioritizing new sidewalks new bike lanes, and that sort of thing. So there is a process that people can follow just to talk about these things. The zoning in front of us today really deals with what's on private property, not what's on the right of way.
Okay, thank you. Can you clarify what the process is when a developer wants to cut down a distinct tree?
Yeah, that's a question that I'm afraid that I can't go into a whole lot of detail here because I'm not, of course, the forester who's responsible for that job. What I would suggest, though, is for the person, if they wanted to send us an email, and we'll be more than happy to put you in contact with our natural systems colleagues who are responsible for developing the urban tree bylaw and the processes, and then we can get you those information so that you can have that information.
One of the thoughts I have around this, and I'm sorry, I'm talking out of my butt, which I shouldn't do, but right now under the provincial statute, if somebody receives approvals to build a given building, whether that is the Committee of Adjustment, the LPAT zoning committee, and it means the removal of a distinctive tree, the city currently doesn't have the power to deny the permit. So if somebody requests variances to build a infill and there is a tree that's going to be removed as a result of that, the tree permit is currently almost a rubber stamp. If this plan succeeds, and I think it will, in reducing the number of variances that are applied for, my hope would be that the city will now have significantly more control over whether or not it extends a permit, and will have more latitude to turn those down.
I think one of the things I think is really important to note, along with the urban tree bylaw, is the change to the processes and that information, that tree information report that now needs to submit it along with building permits. So that's something that, in the past, a building permit could be approved, regardless of whether a tree was there. The tree wasn't applicable law. And so then you sort of had, exactly as you said, Councillor, the situation where there was an after the fact issue going on. But now the tree does need to be disclosed in advance, and that does need to be factored in as part of the permitting process. And there are forestry staff now who will be involved in looking at these applications as well too, and providing commenting back to the Building Code Services Department as well too. So there's some additional protections that are put in place there. As I said, I think the best thing to do would be if the attendee wanted to send us a direct email, then we can put them in touch with the file lead for the tree bylaw review project, and they can provide a lot more fulsome information that we can.
Thank you. Okay, Jeff, it's 8:44. Do you want me to keep going till 9?
Is there anything that is of a different nature in the Q&A list than some of the discussions that we've been having?
Some clarification.
Sorry, I'll just run through.
Yeah.
Eric is asking, rooming houses will be allowed on the corner lots in the heart of the Westboro residential area. What are rooming houses and how do they differ from bunkhouses? What protections will residents have against the problems attributed to bunkhouses in other areas of the city? Important question. I think we probably shouldn't wrap this up without answering it.
Yeah, and I realize I didn't go into full detail on the corner lots and transition zones beyond the 8-unit side. If you look at the zoning document, just to provide a bit of background, we talk about what we call a senior R4 for Churchill Avenue, Byron Avenue, and those major streets. We then talk about we then talk about also a junior R4 for those transition zones and corner lots. So that permits like a smaller scale of apartment building, but the R4 zones also start permitting rooming houses. So to kind of explain that, a rooming house is any sort of situation, essentially very colloquially, where the rental is essentially by the room. You think of a normal like multi-unit building, it's every unit is kind of a self-contained household. They may or may not be related, but they generally share meaningful collective responsibility for the maintenance of their unit. In the case of the rooming house, it's essentially now you're renting it out by the rooming unit, essentially almost renting it out by the room. So an individual is essentially maybe responsible for their room. There are maybe common areas, but they're not necessarily that sort of same collective responsibility as you have for like an apartment. So rooming houses are, when they're permitted, they're subject to processes such as what we call site plan control, the same as apartment buildings. And this process is intended to apply to more intense uses and essentially to provide a bit more of a fulsome review on things like the design of the building, the design of the site, engineering issues such as providing the servicing laterals, dealing with grading on site, a whole host of issues, essentially getting an additional layer of oversight through the planning department. So apartment buildings are subject to that, rooming houses are subject to that. The bunkhouse issue was something that we had been seeing in a number of neighborhoods leading up to, I'd say, 2017, 2018, and we passed a whole number of interim control bylaws in neighborhoods like Sandy Hill in response to this problem. But the problem at its core of what we would talk to when we refer to the bunkhouse is developers were building buildings that they said were like a duplex or a triplex, which are built forms that are not subject to site plan control. But within these individual units, you see basically things like 6 bedrooms or 8 bedrooms or a significant number of bedrooms that's beyond what one would reasonably expect in a bona fide like apartment or dwelling unit. So they were essentially building what in effect was more akin to a rooming house or even multiple rooming houses, while because they were calling themselves a duplex or triplex, were essentially dodging that whole process and oversight that we intend to subject to those more intense uses because they are of a higher density and then require more oversight. A rooming house is a legitimate form of development, but there is a process that we expected to go through. The first phase of the R4 review actually included definitions of a dwelling unit versus a rooming unit, and these were actually intended, despite the name of R4 review, to apply citywide. And one of those things, for example, included limiting the number of bedrooms that could be in a bona fide dwelling unit. So essentially, like I believe it's 4 bedrooms within a dwelling unit, so that there's a bit more certainty when we say we permit 2 dwelling units or 3 dwelling units, as to what that actually permits. So in terms of some of the changes, I think that's how we intend and continue to intend to avoid that bunkhouse issue. There's a process that it has to go through, and if you want to be a rooming house, you got to go through that process.
Thanks. And Erica, please feel free to follow up with us on that because it is a fairly complex area. I just want to ask Kathleen's question and then we'll wrap it up. And I appreciate staff's overtime on this one. Kathleen is asking, this area is an area where people raised families. There is a public school, several daycares, after school programs at Festival House. However, all this intensification is geared toward young singles or couples. Was there any consideration given to maintaining this demographic?
I mean, David, if you want to chime in.
Yeah, let me reply to that. I think that one of the things that we need to just clarify is that families have a broad diversity of housing needs, and as much as there is certainly the detached house certainly provides a large backyard and large private spaces. There's an awful lot of families out there who need different housing as well too. and they need to provide, we need to provide that full diversity of housing types so that families from all incomes, from diversity of tenures, people who can rent, people who need to have a smaller unit, people who need something that costs a little bit less. They need to have the ability to be able to move in and live in a neighborhood as well too. And that's what we're trying to do here. Is it's not about picking and choosing who is going to live in this neighborhood. It is about creating opportunity for different housing styles. It is about creating an opportunity for different diversity of housing types as well too. That's what it's all about. We want to make sure that we have families who need 2 bedrooms, that they can find a reasonable place to live. Families who need 3 bedrooms will also be able to find a reasonable place to live as well too. So this is what it's all about. We need to provide that diversity so that we have people from different walks of life can continue to live in Westboro, and people who have different expectations or different desires can also find a place to live as well too.
Thank you, David, and I'm more than happy offline to chat about that whole question as well. But I would encourage people to take a look at both my R4 blog as well as my blog on this R3 infill study, because this is something with which City Council is grappling, is the increasing unaffordability of housing in our city. And something I am particularly concerned about is the unaffordability of housing in our ward, which is certainly the best ward in the city. There is no better place to try to raise a family than in Westboro or Hintonburg, with the kinds of amenities, the transportation infrastructure, the proximity to green space, the proximity to the beach, the incredible schools that we have. And I am very keen on ensuring that we make our neighborhood available to as many people who can live here in this city as possible, while not losing some of the things that we love about our neighborhood. So with that, I will wrap it up. I want to say thank you very much. Robert has done a lot of the heavy lifting on this file. What you see before you is really 2 years of very hard work. We may not agree with all of it. I am still giving him some significant pushback on some high-level parts of this plan. But despite not agreeing with everything, this is one of the most rigorously thought through neighborhood level looks that I have seen since I became a city councilor. And if this is a model for the kind of rigor, at least, even if you don't agree with the direction, for the kind of rigor that is going to go into our comprehensive zoning bylaw, that gives me significant encouragement. And so, Robert, David, thank you very much. Elaine, thank you for joining us. Fiona, as always, thank you very much for your moderation. Expert as always. And so both the planners and myself are keen to hear your further feedback, to get your questions. My job is to advocate for changes to what is being proposed to the extent that I can get them. This will be a decision that is made by City Council, but my job is to see how we can change this to better reflect what residents want within the larger framework of what City Council wants for its city planning. So please do provide us with your feedback. This will be put on YouTube. I know there was a question about whether or not the slides will be made available, and I'm assuming I can get the slides and put those out with my, on the blog or somewhere easily accessible. Oh, and thank you very much, Robert, for putting up the information there.
I almost forgot.
No, that's great. I appreciate that. So thank you very much to those attending, and we will chat again soon, I'm sure. Thank you very much, everyone. Have a great evening.
Thank you. Thanks, Jeff.
Thank you.
I'll leave this open for a few seconds so people can copy down Robert's email address and the website.
Can you copy paste the remaining questions that we didn't get to answer?
Yes. How will we get them out to people?
I just want to make sure we capture them first, and then we'll think about what to do with them.
Okay.
Just don't want to lose those.
Yeah.
Perfect. All right. That's been a long day. I will see everyone soon. Have a great night.
Jeff.
Guys, thank you very much. That was excellent.
Okay, thank you,
Are we
Robert.
all, are we all done? Okay,
Yeah, we're
perfect.
good.
Everyone's left. All right.
Well,
Have a good
there's
night.
4 people, but I'm closing it now. Okay,
Okay,
thanks.
very good. Have a
Bye.
good night.